This is Land of Havilah, 1 Kings 8a. The Ark of the Covenant was the most holy object in Israel. It was the focal point of the tabernacle until it was no more in the tabernacle. That's because the priests Hophni and Phinehas took it to the battlefield, 1 Samuel 4:4, and the Philistines captured it, 1 Samuel 5:1. As long as the ark was in Philistia, Yahweh sent plagues and death on the Philistines until they were forced to send the ark back to Israel, 1 Samuel 5. The ark finally came into David's possession. He brought it to himself to the part of Jerusalem that existed at that time, called the City of David, also called Zion. He brought it there with much fanfare and rejoicing, 2 Samuel 6:15. Now that Solomon has the temple finished, it's time to move the ark from the tent where David placed it into its new home. Verse 1. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel with all the heads of the tribes, the princes of the fathers' households of the children of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of Yahweh's covenant out of David's city, which is Zion. Comment: a generation ago, when David brought the ark to Jerusalem, he assembled all the leading citizens of Israel to accompany the ark to celebrate its arrival in the old city, 2 Samuel 6:1. Now Solomon is assembling all the leading citizens again from north to south to mark the occasion of the move of the ark to the new part of town into this newly constructed temple. Verse 2. All the men of Israel assembled themselves to King Solomon at the feast in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month. Comment: Yahweh was the author and originator of the Hebrew calendar, Exodus 12:2. It was his calendar. The Hebrew calendar has 12 months, sometimes 13 months in a year, depending on the year. It starts and ends in the spring. The 7th month, Ethanim, coincides with mid-September to mid-October. So this bringing of the ark to the temple occurred in the 7th month at the feast, it says. This is the yearly Feast of Tabernacles, which runs from the 15th to the 21st of the month, Leviticus 23:33 through 36. The name of the feast has been translated to English many different ways: the Feast of Tabernacles, or tents, or booths, or Feast of Ingathering. It marks the completion of the final harvesting of all the crops with which Yahweh has blessed the nation. It was a celebration of possessing the land flowing with milk and honey, rather than wandering in the desert where they couldn't grow crops, or living in Egypt where the crops belonged to their masters, Exodus 34:22. Yahweh ordained this holy week in the time of Moses, along with 6 other yearly observances, Leviticus 23. This festival or feast was one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts on Yahweh's yearly calendar. In other words, it was one of those 3 times per year that by Yahweh's law, all the males of Israel were to present themselves before Yahweh, Exodus 23:17, at a common place, Deuteronomy 12:5 and 12:11. But women went to the pilgrimage feast as well, as illustrated in the time of Christ, when Jesus' entire family went to Jerusalem for the Passover, and at the end, when they went home from the feast, 12-year-old Jesus got left behind. The Feast of Ingathering isn't just about the ingathering of crops. Being a pilgrimage feast, it's also about the ingathering of all God's people, and it has prophetic significance that way. One day, Yahweh will gather in all his people in a final harvest. He's been harvesting people for himself all along, as is recognized by the Feast of First Fruits in late spring. God's very first fruit to be harvested was the risen Christ, 1 Corinthians 15:20. But in the fall, the ingathering of all the crops and all the people has prophetic significance with regard to the end of time, the time at which God will gather in his final crop of people to himself and will all gather together in the heavenly temple of God. So this is a spoiler for what's coming up in the rest of the chapter. God's about to descend on these people and dwell with them, so to speak, as a prophetic pointing to the final gathering at the end of time and his dwelling with us. After all, when Yahweh ordained these observances, he called them his appointed times, Leviticus 23:2. Many translations say feasts or something of that nature, and that is a valid way of translating the term. But to be more accurate, when we read about the 7 yearly so-called feasts, only one of them actually has anything to do with feasting, that being Passover. And we can't rightly even call that one a feast because the Passover meal was to be eaten in haste, Exodus 12:11, and there were only a few prescribed basic hastily prepared foods, which were bitter herbs, Exodus 12:8, which don't sound very tasty, and unleavened bread, Exodus 12:8, which is bread made on the fly. So that's not much of a feast. So with the possible exception of Passover, none of the 7 appointed times has to do with feasting. So it's probably not exactly accurate to translate it that way. So to me, when it says in Leviticus 23:2, feasts of the Lord in many translations, it should rather say something like appointed times, which is also a valid translation. And that's exactly the way, for example, the New American Standard has it. Appointed times, not feasts. Why am I making such a point of this, of calling these days appointed times and not feasts? When we call them feasts, I think we're missing out on the double meaning that God intended for these days. The term appointed times is more appropriate because these days aren't just appointed times on the yearly calendar, they're also appointed times on God's calendar of prophetic events. In other words, when Yahweh created these appointed times, He had the future in mind, appointed times in which, for example, Christ would be crucified on the first of the appointed times of the year, which was Passover. Then in the second appointed time, which was first fruits, God had it in mind to raise Christ from the dead, which indeed happened on that exact day. Those two observances fell within the week-long observance of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is another one of the 7 appointed times. The Week of Unleavened Bread is an appointed time to remember that we're here to escape this world and gain entry to the next, as the Israelites escaped Egypt to gain entry to the Promised Land. Then on the 4th appointed time of the year, what happened? Well, the 4th appointed time of the year is First Fruits, or Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, depending on how you translate it. On that very day, in the year of Christ's crucifixion, lo and behold, the Holy Spirit descended for the first time in Acts chapter 2. So we find that those first 4 appointed times on the yearly calendar were appointed times for major prophetic events to occur, at the times God appointed for them. So that's why I like appointed times rather than feasts. So the first 4 appointed times on the yearly calendar were the very days that there were the crucifixion on Passover, the resurrection on the day of first fruits, the appropriate response to the gospel during the week of unleavened bread, and the first coming of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, all on the exact appointed days that Yahweh laid out in Leviticus 23. All that brings us to the last 3 appointed times on the yearly calendar. The last 3 events of the year are all clustered in the 7th month, the month Ethanim, the month just mentioned in verse 2. On the first day of the month, that's the Day of Trumpets. On the 10th, the Day of Atonement, and on the 15th through the 21st, the Feast of the Ingathering. We have yet to see what prophetic events might occur on these particular days, but from the way things occurred in the year of the crucifixion, we might expect some big things to happen on those days sometime in the future. Maybe, maybe not. But if something does happen on those days, it shouldn't surprise us. What's going to happen? Who knows? God holds His mysteries close to His chest. He's revealed the first 4 to us in the New Testament, but He hasn't revealed the final 3. As for the Day of Trumpets, will that be the day we hear a loud trumpet sound and we're gathered to Him in the air? 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Who knows? And also for the Day of Atonement, which is the day of sacrifices and forgiveness of sin, and then the Feast of Ingathering, who knows what will happen, if anything. But on this particular Feast of Ingathering in Solomon's time, to mark the arrival of the ark in the temple, God's going to dwell personally with His people, coming up as we move along in the chapter. He and His people will all be gathered together. In regard to the same festival mentioned in verse 2, the Feast of Ingathering, in John chapter 7, Jesus' brothers were encouraging Jesus to go to Jerusalem during this particular observance, saying He should take the opportunity to reveal Himself to the world at the feast. But Jesus told His brothers, quote, "My time is not yet at hand," which indicates to me at some point He will reveal Himself openly and plainly to the world, just not yet, as He said. If the time was not yet at hand, He's implying that there will be a time for revealing Himself to the world, but that wasn't it, not in that particular year anyway. Will that very thing, His revealing Himself plainly to the world, occur sometime in the future, coinciding with the Feast of Booths? We'll see. Don't get me wrong, I'm not making any predictions. I have no idea whether those final 3 appointed times have prophetic significance or not, as did the first 4. I'm just throwing some things out there for wonderment. And the Feast of Ingathering being the final appointed time of the yearly calendar, the very name sure does sound like the end of times, the final ingathering of souls, when we're all gathered into the Father and the Lamb. Revelation 21:3. And when we behold him in his fullness, or as Jesus' brothers put it, as he reveals himself. By the way, Jesus did wind up going to that feast, secretly at first, but on the final and greatest day of the feast, he said, quote, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink," John 7:37, which reminds us of drinking freely from the river of the water of life in the New Jerusalem, Revelation 21:6. So it seems that Jesus was adding to the prophetic mystery when he made that statement at the Feast of Ingathering about drinking freely. But now back to bringing the ark to the temple during the Feast of Ingathering, verse 3. All the elders of Israel came, and the priest picked up the ark. Comment, the priest picked up the ark. The ark was fitted with poles for carrying. This is one piece of furniture that will not be rebuilt. This is the original ark constructed in the day of Moses. Verse 4. They brought up Yahweh's ark, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought these up. Comment, in addition to the ark, they packed up the tent of meeting, which was in a separate location, and all the holy vessels or objects that were associated with it. All this was, quote, brought up, as verse 4 just said. We might imagine that they stored all the old tabernacle parts in the side rooms of the temple, but the text isn't specific on that point. The tabernacle was the forerunner of the temple. The history and significance behind all this are unimaginable unless the reader has already walked through the Scriptures to this point. But this is a big, big deal, to close down the tabernacle and bring it up, and to bring the ark to the temple. Verse 5. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled to him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and cattle that could not be counted or numbered for multitude. Comment, when Solomon's father David first tried to move the ark to Jerusalem, a man died because they were handling the ark without observing the protocol for it, 2 Samuel 6:7. The protocol being written in the law of Yahweh given by Moses. So Solomon is being much more careful here to observe the law of Moses with regard to handling the ark. The priests are carrying it, which is according to protocol, and they're appealing to God for favor by sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they couldn't be counted for multitude. All this is out of a healthy fear and respect for the handling and moving of the ark. After all, the ark represents the presence of God, which is an unspeakably holy thing. So they're being very careful and respectful, hoping for one thing, that nobody gets struck dead. Verse 6. The priests brought in the ark of Yahweh's covenant to its place into the inner sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place, even under the cherubim's wings. For the cherubim spread their wings out over the place of the ark, and the cherubim covered the ark and its poles above. The poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they were not seen outside. There they are to this day. Comment, when it says, there they are to this day, this gives us an idea of when this text was written. It was sometime after the ark came to the temple, but before the Babylonians invaded and destroyed it all or took it all away. Remembering the general layout of the temple, the front door was the only outside door other than a side door to the side rooms. The front door opened up to a large room called the Holy Place. Beyond that, there was a room called the Inner Sanctuary, or the Holy of Holies. The two rooms were separated by a veil or curtain, 2 Chronicles 3:14. But for the priest to enter the inner sanctuary, he didn't need to pull back the giant veil because there were doors, 1 Kings 6:31. It seems impossible to set solid doors made of olive wood and plated with gold in a veil, so maybe there was a partial wall that supported the doors, as it says in 1 Kings 6:31, quote, the lintel and doorposts were a fifth part of the wall, end quote. Anyhow, here in verse 8, after they put the ark in place in the inner sanctuary, quote, the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they were not seen outside, end quote. So it seems the doors to the inner sanctuary weren't in the center where a priest could open the doors and look straight at the ark, but on the side where when he opened the doors, he could only see the ends of the poles. And if someone were standing in the exterior door from the porch to the holy place, even if the door to the inner sanctuary were open, there was an angle such that a person couldn't see the ark or even the ends of the poles from that vantage point or from anywhere outside the temple. Verse 9, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets which Moses put there at Horeb when Yahweh made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. Comment, the 2 stone tablets in the ark had the 10 commandments inscribed by Yahweh himself, Exodus 34:1. This was the only object inside the ark when they placed it in Solomon's temple. So sometime between the time of Moses and the time of Solomon, something happened to the other 2 items that were in the ark. There was the golden pot of manna, which testified to God's provision in the wilderness, and Aaron's rod that budded, which testified to the authority vested in Yahweh's leaders. But somewhere along the line, somewhere between Moses and Solomon, those objects disappeared. Only the 2 tablets remain. Verse 10. It came to pass when the priest had come out of the holy place that the cloud filled Yahweh's house, so that the priest could not stand to minister by reason of the cloud, for Yahweh's glory filled Yahweh's house. Comment, so the priest carried the ark into the holy place. After they set it there and came out, something glorious and magnificent occurred. A cloud filled the temple. But it wasn't an ordinary cloud because it prevented the priest from standing to minister. Then the text tells us exactly what it was. It was, quote, Yahweh's glory, end quote, and it filled the house. So that was an awesome thing. The same thing happened when they first set up the tabernacle at the foot of Mount Horeb. Exodus 40:34 and 35, quote, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and Yahweh's glory filled the tabernacle. Moses wasn't able to enter into the tent of meeting because the cloud stayed on it, and Yahweh's glory filled the tabernacle, end quote. After Moses, there certainly wasn't always a visible cloud of glory, but the glory completely departed from the temple or from the tabernacle. When the priests Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas were unfaithful back in the period of the Judges, and ever since the ark was separated from the tabernacle because Yahweh refused to let the symbol of his presence reside in a place of false religion. At that time, Phinehas' widow named her son Ichabod, which means the glory has departed, 1 Samuel 4:21. So that applied to the tabernacle and to all of Israel. The glory of the Lord departed at that time. But now Yahweh has allowed this temple to be constructed, and he's allowed the ark to be successfully placed in it, and his glory has once again come to Israel. This is huge. Solomon's response will be coming up in 1 Kings 8b, which you can find easily at landofhavilah.net. 1 Kings 8b.